October 12th, 1956. A newly opened McDonald's franchise in Des Plaines, Illinois. Ray Kroc, founder not of the restaurant but of the system that powered it, stood under the warm glow of the golden arches, performing an unannounced inspection. His eyes, trained to spot inefficiency, scanned the production line, the gleaming stainless steel, the precise movements of the teenage crew. Then, his attention settled on a single paper sleeve of French fries, fresh from the fryer. To an ordinary customer they might have looked acceptable. To Kroc they were an operational catastrophe. They were limp, oversaturated with grease, and displayed a pale, anemic colour that violated every principle of his meticulously designed process. He picked one up. It bent under its own weight, a greasy indictment of a system built on the promise of absolute, unyielding consistency. For Kroc, this was not a simple culinary error. It was a declaration of war. That one limp potato stick represented a fundamental threat to his entire vision, a vision built not on taste, but on predictability. It was a breach in the fortress of uniformity he was trying to construct across America, a single point of failure that proved the system was vulnerable to its greatest enemy, human inconsistency. The psychological impact of this failure was immediate and profound, shattering the fragile assumption that his operational manual alone was enough to guarantee perfection. The story of how McDonald's built an empire on the industrial-scale perfection of the French fry begins not with the hamburger or the milkshake, but with a fundamental crisis of consistency. It was a battle fought not in corporate boardrooms, but in the deep fryers and potato cellars of a rapidly expanding franchise, where Kroc would be forced to re-engineer his supply chain from the soil up in order to make the humble potato stick into the most reliable and profitable fast food item in the world. In the mid-1950s, Ray Kroc and his rapidly expanding franchise faced a technical dilemma that no operational manual could solve. The problem was not the gleaming stainless steel of the fryers, the quality of the cooking oil, or the training of the crew. Those were controlled variables in Kroc's industrial equation. The true adversary was the raw material itself, the potato. Unlike a standardized bolt or a stamped steel panel, the potato was a biological entity, a product of soil and season, and its internal chemistry was wildly, catastrophically inconsistent. McDonald's was attempting to build a system of absolute uniformity on a foundation of agricultural chaos. The core of the issue lay in two fluctuating chemical components, starch and sugar. An ideal frying potato, typically a russet Burbank, required a high solids content, between 20 and 22%, primarily composed of starch. This high starch concentration was critical. When plunged into oil heated to approximately 177 degrees Celsius, the starch granules would swell and separate, creating a fluffy, steamy interior. At the same time, the surface would dehydrate, forming the rigid, golden brown crust that defined a perfect French fry. A potato with a lower starch content below 18% would absorb more oil, resulting in a greasy, limp product with a dense, waxy texture. It would bend, not break. Even more critical was the variable of sugar, the browning of a French fry as a result of the Maillard reaction, a complex chemical process between amino acids and reducing sugars. A specific, narrow concentration of these sugars was required for the iconic golden brown color. If a potato had too little sugar, the Maillard reaction would fail to initiate properly, producing the pale, anemic, and flavorless fry that Kroc had found so offensive. If, however, the reducing sugar content rose above just 0.5% of the potato's raw weight, the opposite occurred. The sugars would caramelize too quickly, burning the exterior to a dark, bitter brown long before the starchy interior could fully cook. This chemical instability was not random. It was a direct consequence of the potato's life cycle and the logistics of a national supply chain. Potatoes harvested in the fall were placed in cold storage for year-round supply. But when stored at temperatures below 4 degrees Celsius, a potato initiates a survival response. Its starches begin to convert into sugars, acting as a natural antifreeze. A potato held in storage for 2 months could have a sugar content 200% higher than the day it was harvested. Furthermore, potatoes grown in Idaho's volcanic soil possessed a different starch profile from those grown in Washington or Maine. The variables were staggering. Season, region, storage temperature, and storage duration all combine to make the chemical composition of any given bag of potatoes a complete unknown. The A-listers of the fry world were on a collision course with the rest. The result was an operational state of perpetual uncertainty. A franchise in Illinois could be receiving potatoes from a local farm in October and producing perfect fries, while a franchise in California, using potatoes from a cold storage facility in Idaho, produced nothing but dark, bitter rejects from the exact same process. The system was breaking down not because of human error, but because of plant biology. Kroc's vision of coast-to-coast consistency was being undermined by the fundamental, unchangeable nature of the potato itself. A new approach was required. To Ray Kroc, the chemical instability of the potato was not an agricultural curiosity. It was a fundamental declaration of war against his entire philosophy. The McDonald's system was built upon a four-part creed, a mantra that Kroc treated with the fervor of a religious text: quality, service, cleanliness, and value. This was not a marketing slogan. It was a rigid, unyielding operational doctrine, and the inconsistent French fry represented a catastrophic failure on every single front. The concept of quality in Kroc's lexicon did not mean excellent in a culinary sense. It meant absolute replicable uniformity. A McDonald's hamburger purchased in Burbank, California, was engineered to be chemically and physically indistinguishable from one served in Darien, Connecticut. It was a promise of industrial-grade predictability. The French fry, with its wild variations in starch and sugar, was the single greatest point of failure in this equation. It was the rogue element that threatened the integrity of the entire system, proving that the promise of uniformity was a lie. Service, for Kroc, was a function of time. The McDonald's kitchen was a clockwork mechanism, an assembly line calibrated to a theoretical maximum of 50 seconds from order to delivery. This entire choreography depended upon the predictable behavior of every component. A potato with high sugar content that burned to a dark brown in under 2 minutes, while a low-sugar potato remained pale and limp after 3, did more than just create a bad product. It shattered the temporal harmony of the production line. It introduced lag, uncertainty, and chaos into a system whose primary purpose was to eliminate them. It broke the promise of fast. Finally, value was not simply about a low price point. It was about the implicit contract with the customer that their money purchased a guaranteed repeatable experience. The inconsistent fry was a breach of that contract. It undermined the customer's faith that McDonald's was not just another roadside stand, but a reliable, standardized institution. For Kroc, this was the ultimate betrayal. It demonstrated that his operational doctrine, codified in a 75-page manual that specified everything from grill temperature to the exact number of pickles on a hamburger, was vulnerable. The manual could control the man, but it could not control the potato. Kroc's obsession with perfecting the fry, therefore, was not born of a passion for potato gastronomy. It was an ideological crusade. If he could not conquer the inherent inconsistency of the potato, he could not conquer America. The humble fry became the symbolic battleground for his entire vision. The war against the limp, greasy, and unpredictable potato stick would become the driving force behind a technological revolution, a quest to fundamentally re-engineer a product of nature to fit the unyielding demands of his industrial machine. The in-store production process of the 1950s was itself a monument to procedural rigor. Special russet Burbank potatoes delivered in 50-pound bags were first loaded into an automated abrasive peeler. From there, they were fed into a manual cutter, a device which, with a single pull of a lever, forced the potato through a grid of stainless steel blades, producing uniform batons exactly 9/32 of an inch square. These raw fries were then placed in wire mesh baskets and plunged into a vat of beef tallow blend oil, heated to a non-negotiable 177 degrees Celsius for a precise duration. It was a perfectly repeatable mechanical ballet, but it was a performance whose finale was being dictated by an invisible and unpredictable director, the potato's internal chemistry. The entire visual and flavorful success of a French fry hinged on a process known as the Maillard reaction. This is not simple burning or caramelization. It is a complex chemical cascade that begins when amino acids and reducing sugars in the potato surface are exposed to heat above approximately 140 degrees Celsius. The reaction creates hundreds of new aroma and flavor compounds and, critically, the brown-coloured polymers called melanoidins that give the fry its iconic golden hue. A successful Maillard reaction was the difference between a desirable food and a failed product. For Kroc's system, the reaction had to be not just successful, but identical every single time. The process was standardized, but the primary chemical reagent, the sugar content of the potato, was a catastrophic unknown. This chemical determinism revealed its destructive power whenever a batch of potatoes arrived, with a reducing sugar content above the critical threshold of 0.5% raw weight, a common occurrence for potatoes drawn from long-term cold storage. When these high-sugar fries hit the 107-degree oil, the Maillard reaction went into hyperdrive. The abundance of sugar fuel caused the surface to darken and burn to a bitter, acrid shell, often in less than 90 seconds. The interior, however, remained largely raw, its starch granules uncooked, and its texture unpleasantly firm. The result was a culinary deception, a fry that looked overcooked on the outside, but was critically undercooked on the inside. It was a fundamental failure of chemistry. The opposite scenario proved equally ruinous. When a potato possessed too little sugar, the Maillard reaction was starved of its necessary fuel. The hot oil would dehydrate the surface as intended, but without sufficient reducing sugars to react with amino acids, the browning process failed to meaningfully initiate. The fry would emerge from the vat after its full cooking time pale, listless, and visually anemic, the very failure Kroc witnessed in Des Plaines. Worse, without the rapid formation of a sealed crust, the potato structure absorbed a greater percentage of the cooking oil, resulting in the greasy, limp texture that bent under its own weight. This proved an uncomfortable truth. The McDonald's process, for all its mechanical precision, was entirely at the mercy of a biological variable it could neither see nor control. By early 1957, the initial shock from Des Plaines had hardened into a simmering, system-wide frustration for Ray Kroc. The reports were relentless, a cascade of operational failures from franchises across the country. One week, a manager in Phoenix would complain of dark, burnt fries. The next, a report from Cleveland would detail a shipment of potatoes that produced only limp, greasy rejects. During a tense, multi-state tour to enforce compliance, Kroc arrived at a bustling new location in suburban Los Angeles. There, under the California sun, the full scale of the crisis presented itself with terrible clarity. On the stainless steel pass-through, 2 baskets of fries sat side by side. One contained dark, almost mahogany-coloured sticks, radiating a faint, acrid smell. The other held a pile of pale, anemic fries glistening with unabsorbed oil. They were the twin ghosts of his operational nightmare, the physical proof of chemical chaos. For Kroc, this was the final indictment. It was no longer a localized problem or a simple training issue. It was a systemic contagion, and watching the teenage crew follow his 75-page manual to the letter, only to produce 2 diametrically opposed failures, triggered not just anger, but a cold, analytical fury. He bypassed the franchise owner entirely and walked directly to the back of the building, to the small, dark potato cellar. There, he saw bags of russet Burbanks from 2 different suppliers. One, a recent local harvest from Bakersfield, the other drawn from a cold storage facility in Idaho, held in reserve for months. He knew, with the certainty of a man obsessed with his own system's flaws, that he was looking at the source code of the failure: low-sugar potatoes from the fresh harvest producing the anemic fries, and high-sugar potatoes from cold storage producing the burnt ones. This moment represented a fundamental pivot in his thinking. Berating the managers, retraining the crews, enforcing the fryer temperatures, it was all strategically irrelevant. It was like blaming an infantryman for a rifle that fired crooked. The manual, his operational Bible, was predicated on a constant that did not exist. The war for consistency, he realized, could not be won in the kitchen. It had to be won in the supply chain. He was trying to solve a chemical engineering problem with management policy, and he was failing catastrophically. The abstract goal of uniformity, once a core principle, now became an urgent top-down mandate for a permanent technological fix. The solution would not be found in procedure, but in science. Kroc understood that he had to seize control of the potato's biology itself. He either had to find a way to stabilize the raw material before it ever entered a McDonald's restaurant, or he had to bypass the raw potato entirely. The era of simply buying potatoes and hoping for the best was over. A new phase of the war had just been declared, one that would move from the fryer and into the laboratory. The mandate that emerged from Kroc's crisis in Los Angeles was unequivocal, and it initiated a systematic campaign unlike any seen before in the fast food industry. The problem was no longer to be managed in the kitchen, it was to be solved at the level of agricultural science and industrial procurement. A small, dedicated team of what the company called its potato men, a group of hands-on procurement specialists and quality control fanatics, was dispatched with a clear, engineering-driven objective: not to find a good potato, but to define the physical and chemical specifications of the only potato that could perform reliably within the rigid mechanics of the McDonald's system. Their process was not one of culinary tasting, but of industrial analysis. It was a search for a predictable, standardized raw component. The team's cross-country investigation was a process of elimination, a methodical sifting of America's agricultural output against a strict set of operational parameters. They tested dozens of common potato varietals: East Coast round whites, red Norlands from the Dakotas, California Kennebecks. Each was subjected to a battery of tests measuring specific gravity as a proxy for solids content, chemical assays for reducing sugar levels, and geometric analysis to determine processing yield. Most failed immediately. The round whites, while plentiful, were too high in moisture, with solids content frequently below 18%, producing the same greasy limp fries that had triggered the crisis. The red Norlands, with their round shape and deep eyes, resulted in a catastrophic waste factor of over 25% when peeled and cut into the required 9/32-inch batons, producing short, stubby fries that were operationally and aesthetically unacceptable. This process of discovery inexorably led the team to one specific potato, grown in one specific region, the russet Burbank, cultivated in the high, arid plains and rich volcanic soil of Idaho. The analysis confirmed it was superior on every quantitative metric. The Idaho-grown Burbank consistently registered a solids content between 21 and 22%, an ideal density that guaranteed a fluffy, steamy interior and minimal oil absorption. Its unique biology, a product of Idaho's warm days and cool nights, meant it naturally stored its energy as starch rather than sugar, making it far more stable for long-term storage. But it was the potato's physical geometry that proved to be the decisive factor. Its long, oblong and relatively shallow-eyed shape was a revelation of industrial efficiency. When squared off and forced through the 9/32-inch cutting grid, it yielded a higher percentage of long, uniform fries per potato than any other varietal, minimizing waste and maximizing the product the customer would see. The team had found their answer. The Idaho Russet Burbank was not merely a better potato, it was the correct component, a biological machine perfectly tooled for the McDonald's production line. But in solving one problem, they had uncovered a far greater one. Identifying the perfect potato was a victory of analysis. Procuring tens of millions of pounds of this single seasonal crop and delivering it with a consistent chemical profile to hundreds of franchises, 365 days a year, was a logistical and engineering challenge of an entirely different magnitude. The war for consistency was not over. It had just entered its most critical phase. The identification of the Idaho Russet Burbank was a triumph of industrial analysis. It provided a precise data-driven answer to the question of the ideal raw material. But in solving the problem of the component, Kroc's potato men had run headlong into a far more fundamental and unforgiving obstacle: the calendar. The Russet Burbank was a seasonal crop, harvested for a few short months in the late summer and fall. McDonald's, however, was not a seasonal business. Its entire operational creed of quality, service, cleanliness, and value was a promise delivered 365 days a year. This created an immediate and seemingly impossible logistical chasm: how to supply hundreds of franchises with a chemically stable, seasonal vegetable year-round. The conventional answer, then as now, was long-term cold storage. To prevent sprouting and rot, harvested potatoes were held in massive climate-controlled facilities at temperatures between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius. For any other industry, this was a proven effective solution. For McDonald's, it was a chemical catastrophe. A potato stored at these temperatures initiates a biological defense mechanism against the cold. Its enzymatic systems begin to break down complex starches into simple reducing sugars, effectively creating a natural antifreeze to protect its cells. A potato that entered storage with an ideal sugar content of 0.25% could, after 8 weeks in cold storage, exhibit a sugar level exceeding 1.5%, a 500% increase. The operational result was a predictable disaster, a return to the very failures that had launched Croc's crusade. When these high-sugar potatoes were plunged into the 177-degree oil, the Maillard reaction, now wildly overfueled, would burn the exterior to a dark, bitter brown in under 2 minutes, long before the interior had a chance to cook. The potato's own survival mechanism had become the system's most formidable enemy. This created an impossible operational paradox. The very method required to store the perfect potato for year-round use rendered it chemically useless. The tyranny of the season meant McDonald's could only guarantee a perfect fry for a few months out of the year, and only in locations close to the harvest. For a man building an empire on the promise of absolute uniformity, this was not a solution. It was a strategic defeat. While Ray Kroc grappled with a deficit of chemically acceptable potatoes, a different war was being waged on an entirely separate front, over 500 miles away in the high plains of Idaho. This war was not about deficit, but about overwhelming, unmanageable surplus. It was a battle being fought by a man who, in the mid-1950s, was arguably the single most dominant force in the American potato industry, John Richard Simplot. Where Kroc saw the russet Burbank as an elusive, inconsistent component, J.R. Simplot saw it as an industrial-scale output, a seasonal avalanche of product measured in the hundreds of millions of pounds. For Kroc, the problem was acquiring a few perfect potatoes year-round. For Simplot, the problem was what to do with a mountain of them all at once. J.R. Simplot was not a restaurateur. He was a self-made agricultural baron who, starting with a borrowed rifle and a handful of hog-sorting contracts, had built a vertically integrated empire of land, dehydrating plants, and fertilizer factories. By the 1950s, his company was the largest single shipper of fresh potatoes in the nation. This very success, however, chained him to the same tyranny of the season that plagued McDonald's. His entire fortune was tied to a perishable crop that had to be sold or processed within a narrow window. This created brutal market volatility and logistical nightmares. Simplot was an industrialist trapped in a farmer's calendar, and he was searching for a technological escape. The solution he fixated on was radical. It was not dehydrating or canning, it was freezing. The concept of a frozen French fry was not entirely new, but previous attempts had been catastrophic failures. Standard freezing methods, which cooled the product slowly, created large, jagged ice crystals that ruptured the potato's cellular walls. Upon thawing and cooking, the potato structure would collapse, turning the fry into a limp, waterlogged mass. It was the same textural failure Kroc was desperately trying to avoid, but created by ice instead of oil absorption. Undeterred, Simplot poured resources into his own private research and development effort, tasking one of his lead chemists, Ray Dunlap, with solving the puzzle of the frozen fry. The objective was not just to freeze a potato, but to do so in a way that preserved the cellular integrity of the high-starch russet Burbank. Their work centered on the emerging science of quick freezing, a process that sought to flash freeze the fries so rapidly that only microcrystals would form, leaving the cell walls intact. It was an ambitious, capital-intensive race to re-engineer a product of nature. Unbeknownst to Ray Kroc, the technological solution to his impossible operational paradox was being forged, not by a fast food pioneer, but by an Idaho potato magnate trying to solve the exact opposite problem. The paths of the two men, each obsessed with conquering the potato, were beginning to converge. The solution that emerged from Ray Dunlap's laboratory was not a single breakthrough, but a systematic three-stage assault on the physics and chemistry of the potato cell itself. It was a process designed to neutralize the potato's biological liabilities and lock its ideal texture in a state of suspended animation. By 1958, Simplot's team had perfected a method that would fundamentally re-engineer the raw potato into a stable, predictable industrial component. The secret was not merely freezing, but a precise sequence of preparation before the freeze even began. The first stage was a process of controlled blanching. The raw-cut 9/32 batons were briefly immersed in hot water, typically around 70 to 80 degrees Celsius. This was not for cooking. Its primary purpose was chemical sabotage. the heat shock denatured the enzymes, specifically polyphenol oxidase, that would otherwise cause the fries to turn grey and develop off flavours during frozen storage. But the blanching had a second, even more critical effect. It leached a precise amount of the volatile reducing sugars from the surface of the potato. It was a form of industrial-scale sugar management, solving the very problem of burning and bitterness that had plagued Ray Kroc's kitchens from the beginning. The second stage addressed the issue of texture. After blanching, the fries were passed through a tunnel of carefully controlled hot air. This partial dehydration did more than just remove surface moisture. It formed a thin, dry, leathery skin on the exterior of each fry. This membrane was the key to the final crispness. It would act as a protective barrier during frying, preventing the potato's structure from becoming saturated with oil and guaranteeing a crisp crust. The final decisive stroke was the flash freeze. Instead of being slow-cooled, the blanched and dried fries were blasted with supercooled air, with temperatures plummeting to as low as -40 degrees Celsius. This extreme thermal shock caused the water inside the potato cells to freeze almost instantly, forming only microscopic, harmless ice crystals. The large, jagged crystals that ruptured cell walls in conventional freezing never had a chance to form. The potato's delicate, starchy cellular structure was preserved perfectly intact. The result was a product that represented a complete technological victory. Simpler had not just frozen a potato, he had created a chemically stable, structurally sound, and operationally perfect component. It was a fry that could be stored for months without degradation, shipped thousands of miles, and finished in any fryer across the country, emerging with the exact same golden brown colour, the same fluffy interior, and the same rigid, crisp exterior every single time. Unbeknownst to them, the team in Idaho had created the perfect ammunition for Ray Kroc's war on inconsistency. The solution had been found. The two men just hadn't found each other yet. The convergence occurred in early 1965, not in a boardroom, but in a clandestine meeting arranged in a nondescript test kitchen near McDonald's Illinois headquarters. J.R. Simplot, the Idaho potato magnate, finally secured an audience with Ray Kroc's most trusted lieutenants, including future CEO Fred Turner. To this team, men who had spent a decade fighting a daily war against the chemical inconsistencies of the raw potato, Simplot's proposal was operational heresy. He was not there to offer a more stable supply of fresh russet Burbanks. He was there to sell them frozen French fries. The very concept was anathema. To Kroc's inner circle, frozen was synonymous with the cheap, waterlogged, and texturally inferior products that populated supermarket freezers. It represented a compromise on quality, a violation of the freshness principle that, in theory, separated McDonald's from its lesser competitors. Their entire operational identity was built on the difficult, expensive, and often failing process of transforming a raw vegetable in store. Simplu, an industrialist who understood that data and results were the only currency that mattered to men like this, wasted little time on salesmanship. He proposed a direct empirical test. It would be a blind comparison, fought in the deep fryer. On one side, the McDonald's team would prepare their fries using the exacting protocol of their 75-page manual. Peeling, cutting the 9/32-inch batons from the highest-grade fresh russet Burbanks they could procure, and rinsing them for preparation. On the other side, Simplot's team would simply open a plain cardboard box of their pre-cut, blanched, and flash-frozen product. The 2-wire baskets, one holding pale, raw potato sticks and the other holding hard, frost-covered batons, were lowered into 2 identical fryers, each holding the signature beef tallow blend heated to a non-negotiable 177 degrees Celsius. For the McDonald's team, it was a test to confirm their own biases. The result was a quiet, operational apocalypse that shattered every assumption in the room. When the baskets were lifted, the fresh fries displayed their characteristic, unavoidable inconsistency, a mix of perfect golden sticks, a few paler, slightly limp ones, and 1 or 2 that were a shade too dark. It was the statistical reality of their daily battle. The frozen fries, however, were a revelation of absolute uniformity. Every single fry was the exact same shade of golden brown. Every single fry was structurally rigid, standing arrow straight. A sample was taken. The audible snap of the crust, a direct result of the partial drying process Simplot's team had perfected, was followed by an interior that was perfectly fluffy and steamy. the physical manifestation of cell walls left intact by the flash freeze. The uncomfortable truth became immediately, undeniably apparent. Simplot's product was not a mere substitute. It was superior. It was the idealized platonic form of the McDonald's French fry they had been chasing for a decade, but had only ever achieved sporadically. The blanching process had solved the sugar problem. The partial drying had solved the texture problem. The flash freezing had solved the storage problem. Simplot had not just frozen a potato. He had used industrial science to neutralize biology itself. He had created a standardized, predictable, and perfect component. In that moment, the McDonald's team understood. The war for the perfect fry was over. The only question now was accepting the terms of surrender. The report from Fred Turner was delivered to Ray Kroc not as a recommendation, but as a verdict. The data from the test kitchen was unequivocal, a stark set of numbers and observations that confirmed what the team had witnessed. Simplot's frozen product was not merely stable, it was superior in every measurable metric. It produced a fry of perfect color, perfect texture, and perfect structural integrity, 100% of the time. The test had demonstrated a terrible, uncomfortable truth. Their own in-store, fresh process, the very symbol of their supposed quality, was demonstrably inferior to an industrially produced frozen alternative. For Kroc, this created a conflict that transcended operations and entered the realm of philosophy. On one side was the powerful, almost sacred marketing concept of freshness, the story of peeling real potatoes in-house, a narrative that resonated deeply with the American consumer. On the other was the cold, hard data of industrial perfection. He stood at a precipice, forced to choose between the story his company told and the system his company was. The calculation Kroc made was not that of a chef, but that of a systems engineer. The appeal of fresh was an asset, but it was an asset with a catastrophic liability attached. Freshness, in the form of the raw potato, was the source of all his inconsistency. It was the biological insurgency inside his fortress of uniformity. It demanded massive storage space in his small restaurants, generated unpredictable waste from rot and peeling, and required a significant labor commitment from his crews. It was, in short, an uncontrolled variable in an equation that tolerated none. Simplot's frozen product, by contrast, offered the one thing Kroc valued above all else: absolute control. The financial and operational arithmetic was brutal and clear. It would eliminate in-store peeling and cutting, freeing up valuable labor and floor space. It would reduce waste to virtually zero. It would allow for perfect portion control and inventory management. Most importantly, it would guarantee that the French fry served in Bangor, Maine, was physically and chemically identical to one served in San Diego, California, 365 days a year. It was the final missing component needed to perfect his machine. The decision, when it came, was therefore inevitable. It was a pragmatic gamble made with the cold confidence of an industrialist. Ray Kroc made the call to abandon the ideal of freshness for the unyielding reality of consistency. He chose to sacrifice the romantic, marketable story of the in-house potato for the silent, invisible perfection of a pre-processed component. It was a quiet betrayal of a public-facing myth, but a profound affirmation of his deepest operational creed. The McDonald's system was not built to celebrate the unpredictable beauty of nature. It was built to deliver the absolute, unyielding certainty of the factory. The war against the potato was over. The surrender was unconditional. When the directive to switch to frozen fries was issued from Kroc's headquarters, it was not received by the franchise owners as an operational godsend. It was received as a profound and devastating betrayal. To the men and women on the ground, the early pioneers who had invested their life savings into Kroc's system, the order to remove their potato peelers and cutting stations felt like an assault on the very foundation of their business. It triggered an immediate and visceral psychological backlash, born from a fundamental disconnect between Kroc's industrial definition of quality and the franchisee's more conventional, customer-facing interpretation of the word. For these owner-operators, the narrative of freshness was not a marketing abstraction. It was a daily physical reality. The 50-pound bags of raw russet Burbank stacked in their storerooms, the rhythmic hum of the peeler, the manual labor of cutting the fries, these were tangible proofs of their commitment to a superior product. They were the visible symbols that separated a McDonald's from a common roadside stand selling pre-made frozen food out of a box. To them, frozen was a term associated with inferior quality, convenience over craft, and the cheap waterlogged products that populated supermarket freezers. Croc's decision represented a catastrophic demotion, a move to sacrifice the brand's perceived integrity for the sake of operational convenience. The fear was immediate and deeply personal. Franchisees envisioned a customer backlash, an exodus of patrons who would detect the factory taste of the new product and abandon them. They had built their local reputations on the promise of hot, fresh French fries, and they believed this change would shatter that trust. The announcement created a state of profound cognitive dissonance. They had been indoctrinated into Croc's creed of unyielding quality, and had spent years fighting the war against inconsistent potatoes in their own kitchens. Now they were being told the solution was to adopt the very type of product they had defined themselves against. It felt like a declaration that their hard work, their struggles, and their pride in the craft of making the perfect fry had been meaningless. This resistance was more than just a business calculation, it was an identity crisis. The arduous process of in-store potato preparation, for all its problems, was the last vestige of traditional restaurant work within Croc's hyper-efficient system. It allowed franchisees to see themselves as restaurateurs, not just managers of a vending machine. Removing it reduced their role to simply heating and bagging a prefabricated component. It was the final, definitive step in transforming their establishments from kitchens into assembly nodes. They were being asked to surrender their identity as makers of food and become mere minders of a factory line. To Ray Kroc, the franchisee rebellion was not an emotional crisis to be managed, but an operational variable to be neutralized. He would not quell it with reassurances, memos, or threats. He would crush it with data. His response, therefore, was not a negotiation but an empirical demonstration, a clinical and decisive event he called the performance test. It was a strategy born of his unshakable faith in systems and evidence, a belief that any emotional resistance could be systematically dismantled by an overwhelming, undeniable truth. The logic was brutal and direct. If the franchisees believed their fresh process was superior, they would be forced to prove it in a blind, controlled experiment against the frozen product. In the spring of 1966, a select group of the most vocal and influential franchise owners was summoned to a test kitchen at the company's headquarters in Illinois. They arrived as proud defenders of a craft, confident in the superiority of their in-house process. What they walked into was not a kitchen, but a laboratory. The room was divided into two identical stations, each with a standard-issue McDonald's fryer heated to precisely 177 degrees Celsius. At Station A, a senior technician performed the familiar ritual, peeling, cutting, and rinsing the highest-grade Idaho russet Burbanks available. At Station B, an anonymous assistant simply opened a plain cardboard box of frozen fries. The test was conducted under a strict blind protocol. Fries from each station were cooked and placed into wire baskets, marked only with a random code, then presented on identical trays. The judges were the franchisees themselves. The process was repeated multiple times. Each time the owners, men who had staked their reputations on the concept of freshness, were asked to evaluate the two products side by side. They judged based on color uniformity, structural rigidity, texture, and taste. The room was silent, filled only with the sound of scribbling on scorecards and the audible snap of fries being tested for crispness. With each round, an uncomfortable pattern began to emerge. The fresh fries, even under these ideal conditions, exhibited their inherent unavoidable variance. A few were perfect, but some were slightly limp, others a shade too pale. The product from the coded baskets, however, was a monument to uniformity. Every single fry was the exact same shade of golden brown. Every single fry was rigid. At the end of the day, the scorecards were collected and the results tallied on a large board for all to see. The data was not just overwhelming, it was apocalyptic for the cause of the fresh potato. In nearly every category, across a statistically significant sample size of the franchisee's own judgments, the anonymous frozen product was rated as superior. Then came the final reveal, as the technician at Station B held up the plain cardboard box from Simplot. The silence in the room was absolute. The franchisees had not just been defeated, they had been forced to author their own defeat. Their rebellion, born of a passionate belief in the story of freshness, had been clinically executed by the scientific method. The data was their own, the verdict was final, the argument was over. With the franchise rebellion clinically dismantled by the irrefutable evidence of the performance test, Ray Kroc possessed the internal mandate he needed to finalize his war. The emotional arguments for freshness had been vaporized by superior data. The path was now clear not for a negotiation, but for an integration. The handshake that followed, a now legendary agreement between Ray Kroc and J.R. Simplot in late 1966, was therefore not a complex legal settlement between a buyer and a seller. It was a pact between two industrialists who, from opposite ends of the economic spectrum, had arrived at the exact same conclusion: that nature was a variable to be controlled, and scale was the ultimate weapon. Kroc had perfected the retail machine. Simplot had perfected the agricultural factory. Their agreement was the final logical step in locking the two systems together. The implications of this handshake were profound. This was not a simple supply contract. It was the founding charter of a logistical revolution. In an instant, the agreement rendered obsolete McDonald's entire existing supply structure. A chaotic, decentralized network of several hundred franchises contracting independently, with thousands of local farm stands, regional produce brokers, and potato distributors. It was a system plagued by seasonal volatility, geographical inconsistency, and zero central control. The Simplot deal swept this entire framework away, replacing it with a single, streamlined, and centrally managed industrial pipeline. One phone call from McDonald's corporate headquarters could now direct the output of Simplot's multi-million-dollar processing plants in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, commanding a flow of hundreds of millions of pounds of perfectly standardized fries. The agreement effectively integrated Simplot's factories into McDonald's own centralized control system. For the first time, McDonald's was not merely buying a raw material, it was dictating the precise chemical and physical specifications of a finished component at its point of manufacture. Simplot's blanching vats, drying tunnels, and flash freezers became, in an operational sense, the first stage of the McDonald's assembly line, located 1,000 miles away from the final fryer. It was the ultimate fulfillment of Kroc's vision. Control was extended beyond the walls of the restaurant, beyond the 75-page manual, all the way back to the processing plant. It was control by proxy, a vertical integration of the supply chain without the burden of ownership. This was the synthesis that finally won the war. The logistical revolution it triggered was immediate and absolute. The potato lottery was over. The tyranny of the season was broken. By binding Simplot's industrial capacity to its own national retail footprint, McDonald's had forged a new model of industrial food production, one built on centralized power, unprecedented scale, and unyielding consistency. The fry problem was solved. But in solving it, the two men had created a blueprint that would go on to redefine the entire American food system. The handshake between Kroc and Simplot did more than just solve a chemical problem. It unleashed a staggering economic realignment that fundamentally re-engineered the business model of every McDonald's franchise. The consequences inside the restaurants were immediate and profound. The entire apparatus of in-store potato preparation, the bulky peelers, the cutting stations, the rinsing sinks, the dedicated man-hours, was rendered obsolete overnight. What previously required an estimated 15 to 20 labor hours per restaurant per week was reduced to the 30-second task of opening a box and loading a fryer basket. Labor costs dedicated to fry preparation cratered by over 95%. Simultaneously, the switch solved a second, equally costly problem: waste. The fresh potato system had hemorrhaged value at every stage. Industry estimates placed raw material loss from peeling, trimming, and cutting at between 15 and 20% of every 50-pound bag. An additional percentage was lost to rot, spoilage, and entire batches being discarded due to the chemical failures of an inconsistent crop. The Simplot system eliminated this entirely. Every frozen fry in the box was a usable, profitable unit of product. Waste was reduced to virtually zero. This ruthless efficiency extended even to real estate. The removal of peeling equipment and potato storage cellars freed up an average of 40 to 50 square feet per location, precious, revenue-generating space in the company's compact, high-volume restaurant footprints. But it was the newfound predictability of cost that proved to be the single most decisive factor. The chaotic, seasonal price fluctuations of raw potatoes were replaced by a single, stable, centrally negotiated price per pound for the finished component. For the first time, a franchisee could calculate their food costs with absolute mathematical precision, month after month. This cost certainty became the bedrock of the most explosive franchise expansion in American history. It transformed the McDonald's franchise from a high-risk venture into a reliable, bankable investment with predictable margins. The number of McDonald's restaurants skyrocketed, growing from just over 700 locations in 1965 to more than 3,500 by the early 1970s. The frozen French fry was not just a better product. It was a standardized, fungible, and infinitely scalable unit of profit. It was the final component that turned a restaurant chain into a global empire. July 20th, 1971. The bustling Ginza shopping district in Tokyo, Japan. Inside the country's first McDonald's restaurant, a space just over 500 square feet, crew members worked at a ferocious pace to serve a line of customers that stretched for blocks. To the thousands of Japanese patrons tasting their first McDonald's hamburger, it was a moment of cultural novelty. But inside the kitchen, a far more significant event was unfolding with quiet, industrial grace. An employee opened a plain cardboard box, shipped thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean from a processing plant in Washington state, and emptied a cascade of pale, hard, frozen batons into a fryer basket. This was the systems field application on a global scale. This was the moment of truth. The story of McDonald's transformation from an American phenomenon into a global empire begins not with marketing campaigns or franchising agreements, but with the cold, hard physics of that frozen French fry. The Simplot system did more than solve Croc's domestic consistency problem. It provided the single most critical enabling technology for international expansion. It was the logistical master key that unlocked the globe, transforming an operationally impossible dream into a mathematical certainty. Without the frozen fry, the McDonald's system, in its unyielding demand for uniformity, could never have crossed an ocean. The thought of sourcing chemically stable potatoes in Japan, Germany or England in the 1970s was an operational nightmare. Local agricultural realities would have shattered the model. Japanese May Queen or Danshaku potatoes possessed a waxy texture and sugar profile completely incompatible with the 107 degrees Celsius beef tallow process. British King Edwards or Maris Pipers presented their own set of chemical variables. To deliver a consistent product would have required a complete re-engineering of the frying process for every country, a betrayal of the entire principle of a single universal system. The promise of McDonald's would have been lost in translation. The frozen fry rendered this entire complex equation obsolete. The fry was no longer an agricultural product to be procured, but a finished industrial component to be shipped. It effectively decoupled the McDonald's kitchen from the local farm, making the agricultural realities of Japan or Britain strategically irrelevant. The blanching, drying and flash freezing process in a Simplot facility in the Pacific Northwest locked in the perfect chemical and textural properties of the Idaho russet Burbank. The fry became a self-contained unit of sensory information, a standardized shipping container of flavor and texture that behaved identically in a fryer in Des Plaines, Tokyo or London. This innovation transformed the impossible challenge of global quality control into a straightforward problem of frozen logistics, a problem that shipping companies and military quartermasters had already solved. The system was now plug and play. A new franchise, whether in a Munich suburb in 1971 or a Woolwich High Street in London in 1974, no longer needed an apparatus for potato preparation or a deep understanding of local crop science. It simply needed a freezer and a reliable shipping lane back to the United States. The frozen fry was the universal translator. It guaranteed that the most critical, profit-driving, and recognizable sensory experience of the McDonald's brand would be absolutely, flawlessly identical, from Tokyo to Amsterdam to Sydney. It was the component that made the system exportable and proved that Croc's empire of uniformity truly had no borders. Late 1968. A boardroom at the Burger King corporate headquarters in Miami, Florida. The atmosphere was one of deep strategic anxiety. For years, executives had struggled with the exact same operational demons that had once tormented Ray Kroc: inconsistent fry quality, seasonal price shocks, and the high labor costs of in-store potato preparation. But now, franchisee reports carried a new and far more alarming message. The problem was no longer just their own inconsistency. It was the brutal, unwavering consistency of the competition. Customers were noticing. A Burger King franchisee in a Chicago suburb reported that his sales were down, citing customers who matter-of-factly stated that the fries at the McDonald's down the street were simply better, crispier, more uniform, and always the same. The handshake between Kroc and Simplot had not been a private business deal. It was a declaration of industrial war, and the rest of the fast food industry had been caught completely, catastrophically unaware. Suddenly, McDonald's rivals like Burger King, A&W, and a fledgling chain out of Ohio named Wendy's found themselves on the wrong side of an enormous and seemingly insurmountable technological divide. They were facing what industry analysts would later call the fry gap. While their franchisees were still allocating 15 to 20 man-hours a week to the messy, wasteful work of peeling and cutting raw potatoes, their McDonald's counterparts were simply opening a box. While their food costs were subject to the wild seasonal swings of the agricultural market and a 20% loss from waste, McDonald's had a fixed, predictable cost per pound. The psychological impact on the leadership of these competing chains was profound. It shattered the comfortable assumption that everyone was fighting the same war of operational attrition. The truth, revealed with terrible clarity in their rivals' surging growth and profitability, was that McDonald's was no longer fighting that war at all. They had achieved a decisive victory through superior technology and logistics, and were now operating on an entirely different plane of industrial efficiency. The arithmetic of the competition had been fundamentally and permanently altered. This realization triggered a frantic, high-stakes scramble. Burger King and others were now forced to reverse engineer their rivals' success. Their procurement teams, once focused on sourcing raw potatoes, were redeployed with a new urgent mission to find or create their own industrial-scale frozen fry supply chain. They had to find their own Simplot. The question was no longer whether to abandon the fresh model. Its inferiority had been proven decisively in the marketplace. The only question was how quickly they could replicate the system that their rival had so secretly and so successfully pioneered. The age of the in-store potato was over. To survive, everyone else had to join the frozen revolution. September 20th, 1988. Phil Sokoloff, a self-made construction magnate from Omaha, Nebraska, stood over the final proof for a full-page advertisement set to run in the New York Times. It was not a product announcement or a corporate prospectus. It was an instrument of war. The headline was stark, designed for maximum psychological impact: "The Poisoning of America." Beneath it, the ad laid out a brutal direct-action assault against the country's largest fast food chains, with McDonald's as its primary target. The weapon in this case was not a new technology or a rival business model. It was a single, devastating accusation centered on the chemical composition of the McDonald's French fry. The story of the fry's Second Great War begins not with a failure of consistency, but with a crisis of perception. For 2 decades, the Kroc Simplot system had operated as a fortress of industrial perfection. But this new enemy, a coalition of public health advocates, media scrutiny, and a determined Nebraska tycoon, had found a vulnerability no one had ever thought to guard. They were attacking the one ingredient that could not be easily changed, the very chemical soul of the product, the beef tallow used to cook the fries. The original iconic flavor of a McDonald's French fry was the deliberate result of a proprietary blend known as Formula 47. Developed in the 1960s, it consisted of approximately 93% beef tallow, rendered beef fat, and 7% cottonseed oil. The choice was a matter of pure performance. The tallow possessed a high smoke point, making it exceptionally stable in the 107°C fryers. But its true value was sensory. It imparted a rich, savory, almost meaty flavor that was the unmistakable signature of the brand, a taste profile that focus groups and decades of sales had confirmed was functionally irreplaceable. It was the taste of success. The man who now branded this ingredient a poison was Phil Sokoloff. He was not a competitor. He was a self-made millionaire who, in 1966, had suffered a near-fatal heart attack at the age of 43. The event transformed him into a relentless anti-cholesterol crusader. Using millions from his own fortune, he established the National Heart Savers Association, a one-man army dedicated to a single, fanatical cause: the eradication of high-saturated fat foods from the American diet. His Poisoning of America ads were the culmination of this personal war, and they were lethally effective. Positioned not as opinion but as a public health bulletin, the ads claimed that the saturated fat in a serving of McDonald's fries exceeded that of a bacon and eggs breakfast. The implication was clear and morally charged. McDonald's was prioritizing a signature flavor over the cardiovascular health of its customers. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. This was not a logistical problem to be solved with a better supply chain, or a competitive threat to be outmaneuvered with superior economics. It was a fundamental assault on the product's identity. The secret ingredient that had guaranteed the fry's universally beloved flavor was now being publicly reframed as a lethal toxin. McDonald's, a corporation that had achieved global domination through the science of consistency, now faced a terrible new dilemma. The public, armed with a new vocabulary of cholesterol and saturated fats, was beginning to demand that they change the perfect product. The era of industrial triumph was over. A new war, one to be fought in the chemistry lab and the court of public opinion, had just begun. Early 1989, the executive boardroom at McDonald's corporate headquarters in Oak Brook, Illinois, a command center now under siege. Spread across the vast conference table were not sales projections or logistical schematics, but copies of Phil Sokolov's full-page newspaper advertisements. For McDonald's new CEO, Michael Quinlan, and his leadership team, these documents represented a threat more fundamental than any competitor or supply chain failure they had ever faced. Sokolov's campaign was a brilliant and brutal act of asymmetrical warfare. The battlefield was not the marketplace, but the court of public opinion, and the weapon was not a better product, but a single, damning narrative. The war for the perfect fry, once won through the predictable physics of industrial engineering, had been reignited as a battle of perception, fought with the unpredictable chemistry of public fear. The leadership team found themselves trapped in a strategic paradox, a tactical dilemma with no clean operational solution. The problem was no longer one of consistency, but of composition. For over 2 decades, the soul of the McDonald's French fry resided in a proprietary cooking medium known as Formula 47. This blend, composed of approximately 93% beef tallow and 7% cottonseed oil, was not an accident. It was a deliberate and critical piece of sensory engineering. The tallow's high smoke point ensured operational stability in the 177-degree fryers, but its true function was to impart the rich, savory, and utterly unique flavor that had become the brand's most recognizable and beloved signature. This flavor was the result of a complex interplay of lipids and flavor compounds that vegetable oil, a simple triglyceride, could not replicate. To abandon the tallow was to risk voluntarily destroying the very taste that had built an empire. On the other side of the equation was the inexorable force of a national health panic. The terms cholesterol and saturated fat had entered the public lexicon with the force of a moral judgment. Sokolov had successfully reframed Formula 47 not as an ingredient but as a poison. The company's own greatest asset, its unique and universally adored flavor, was now its greatest public liability. The leadership could choose to defy the public outcry, standing by the taste that had driven billions in sales and in doing so, confirm every accusation of corporate malfeasance. Or they could capitulate, switching to a 100% vegetable oil blend to appease the health crusaders, and in doing so, risk producing a bland, anonymous, and texturally inferior fry that would betray the expectations of millions of loyal customers a day. It was a choice between a public relations nightmare and an act of potential product suicide. The arithmetic of this new war was fundamentally different. The prior conflict against the potato was one with the cold, hard data of efficiency, waste reduction, and cost per pound. This war would be decided by the slippery calculus of consumer perception and negative press. The psychological impact of Sokolov's campaign was already registering in franchisee reports and internal polling. McDonald's, the master of uniformity and control, was losing control of its own story. The choice, therefore, became clear. They could not win a direct public fight over the nutritional science of beef tallow. The battle had to be moved back to the laboratory. The directive that emerged from that boardroom was a secret and seemingly impossible one. Recreate the flavor of beef without the beef. It was a quiet declaration of a new kind of war, a war to save the soul of the French fry by performing a complete chemical transplant. On July 23, 1990, McDonald's made a public announcement that reverberated across the American food landscape. Bowing to the relentless pressure orchestrated by Phil Sokoloff and the rising tide of public health concerns, the company declared it was switching from its signature beef tallow blend to 100% vegetable oil for cooking its French fries. To the media and the public, it was presented as a capitulation, a responsible corporation making a healthier choice. But behind the closed doors of its Oak Brook Research and Development Labs, this public surrender was the opening shot in a secret and audacious new technological war. The true mission was not simply to change the oil, it was to chemically counterfeit a memory. The problem facing McDonald's food scientists was one of monumental complexity. Formula 47, the 93% beef tallow blend, was not merely a passive cooking medium. It was an active, flavor-generating ingredient. When heated to 177 degrees Celsius, its specific and complex lipids would break down in a process called pyrolysis, creating a unique and irreplaceable cocktail of hundreds of volatile aromatic compounds: aldehydes, furans, pyrazines, and ketones. These were the molecular building blocks of the iconic McDonald's fry flavor, a rich, savory, and faintly beefy note that vegetable oil, a simple neutral triglyceride, could not hope to replicate on its own. A simple switch would result in a bland generic product, a betrayal of the sensory promise that had defined the brand for 3 decades. Therefore, as the company publicly capitulated on one front, it privately initiated a new top-secret technical teardown, what insiders would come to call their own Manhattan Project. The objective was not to find a new flavor, but to deconstruct the old one at a molecular level and rebuild it from scratch. A team of elite flavor chemists was tasked with an unprecedented mission of reverse engineering. Their first step was analytical. Using advanced tools like gas chromatographs and mass spectrometers, they had to map the precise chemical fingerprint of heated Formula 47. They had to isolate every single significant compound that contributed to the iconic taste and aroma. This was only half the battle. Once this molecular blueprint was established, Phase 2 began. The scientists had to recreate that exact sensory experience using an entirely new set of ingredients. They had to source or synthesize these specific flavor compounds from vegetable and dairy origins, a process that allowed the final ingredient list to legally state the anodyne phrase, natural flavor. They were not just changing an ingredient, they were tasked with building a chemical ghost. It was a desperate high-stakes campaign to capture the very soul of beef tallow in a bottle, ensuring the public would never taste the difference. The mission assigned to the Oak Brook flavor chemists was a success. By the time the switch to 100% vegetable oil was rolled out in 1990, the proprietary natural flavor additive was ready for deployment. It was a complex cocktail of compounds, derived from sources like wheat and milk, which when hydrolyzed, produced the precise savory, faintly beefy notes that gas chromatographs had identified in heated Formula 47. This chemical ghost was not added in the restaurant. It was integrated into the industrial process itself. At the simpler plants, after being blanched and partially dried, the fries were briefly puff-fried in the new vegetable oil now dosed with the natural beef flavor. The flavor was locked onto the fry's surface just before it was flash-frozen. The result was a stunning act of chemical ventriloquism. The public, promised a healthier product, consumed a fry whose signature taste was a meticulously crafted illusion, delivered silently from a lab. The mass customer backlash never materialized. The sales held steady. The system had performed a perfect chemical transplant, and almost no one noticed the scar. This secret victory was more than a brilliant feat of food science. It was the ultimate, almost terrifying fulfillment of Ray Kroc's original vision. The war that began with a single limp potato was founded on a simple, ruthless principle. Any variable that threatens absolute consistency must be controlled, neutralized, or replaced. For decades, the enemy was the potato's unpredictable biology. The solution was an industrial process of blanching, drying, and freezing. When the enemy became the public's perception of a natural fat, the solution was simply a more advanced form of the same industrial logic. The system treated the public's fear of cholesterol with the same cold, analytical fury it had once applied to the potato's sugar content. Both were simply undesirable variables to be engineered out of the equation. The journey from peeling raw russets in a back room to synthesizing beef flavor in a laboratory was the story of an industrial fortress expanding its walls. First, the system conquered agriculture, replacing the chaos of the harvest with the certainty of the factory. It then conquered geography, using the frozen supply chain to make distance and location irrelevant. Finally, it conquered the very chemistry of its own signature ingredient, swapping a volatile component of nature for its stable, synthetic ghost. The McDonald's French fry, by the end of the 20th century, had completed its transformation. It was no longer a piece of food in the traditional sense. It was a perfectly engineered, globally distributed and chemically unassailable unit of sensory information, designed to be identical in Des Plaines, Tokyo and Moscow. The war against the inconsistent potato had been won. The war against inconvenient fats had been won. In the end, the fry was no longer a product of the soil. It was a product of the system.